The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. The United States Treasury Department is going to be conducting an investigation into why there has been a delay in the production of the new $20 bill, which of course is going to feature a portrait of slave-turned-slave emancipator Harriet Tubman. This was announced back in 2016. Former President Andrew Jackson's face would be replaced with that of the famous abolitionist in 2020. And this is an update that would make Harriet Tubman the first woman since Martha Washington to appear on American currency notes and the first African-American, period. Last month, we heard from Donald Trump's Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin, that this would be delayed by 8 years until 2028. Democratic Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer asked for the department to launch an investigation last week, and that is going to happen. So, you know, Pat, this is one of those things where, I mean, it's so childish to think that this may be related to the fact that it is red meat for Trumpists to hear that they are deliberately delaying replacing Andrew Jackson, who Donald Trump says he likes, with a black slave abolitionist on currency. I hate to imagine that something so childish is going on, but this is the Trump administration, and it genuinely might be, and it should be investigated because there actually may be some basis in that.
Well, we shouldn't attribute to malice what we can otherwise attribute to incompetence, right? Is it possible that Steve Mnuchin and the other folks at the Treasury Department just have bigger fish to fry right now, and they're not focused entirely on getting Harriet Tubman's face on the $20 bill because they have other things to worry about? I guess that's a possibility, but Steve Mnuchin didn't really lay out that as an explanation when he testified before Congress. He just sounded altogether disinterested in this.
Yeah,
and
but think about
bad.
this, though. If this was announced in 2016 and the idea was for it to happen in 2020, that's 4 total years. How do you suddenly need 8 more years as a surprise? Like this is when I'm supposed to meet someone at 1 p.m. Excuse me. And I know that it's a half-hour ride for them. And at 12:55, they say that they are running a half hour late. Like, it takes you a half hour to get there. You would have known that 25 minutes ago. How is it possible that now the delay is as long as the duration of the entire trip? It's a very similar thing here. How is there now suddenly an 8-year delay for a process that we thought took 4 years? You would have known that years ago.
Yeah, I think I am now ready to attribute this to malice. And I think it's partially just because I think it is because they calculate that this is going to be bad for their base, which is surprising to me in a sense. Like, would there be any like staunch Trump supporters who decide to switch and vote for Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden because Trump replaced Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill with Harriet Tubman?
No,
I don't think there are that many people out there.
But it's more complex than that. It's not, wow, if I allow this, even though it predates my presidency, I'm going to lose voters. It's part of the throwing of red meat to the base so that they have the general impression that they just kind of like how Trump has been handling things. I think you're right. It's not that voters will say, Harriet Tubman on a 20 decided while Obama was president, I'm voting for Bernie. Like, no, that's not what it is, but it's the constant sort of fomenting of the feeling, because it's all feelings over facts, the feeling that they just like the way Trump is managing things. And delaying Harriet Tubman on the 20 and keeping Andrew Jackson might generate more of that exact same feeling for them.
Yeah, and actually, Harriet Tubman, the initial plan was for her to be on the $10 bill, but people who had just gone out and seen the musical Hamilton were not happy with that because that would be replacing Alexander Hamilton. So they picked the 20, and you'd think that the $20 bill would be a clear choice because Andrew Jackson perpetrated the Trail of Tears, or a forced march of Native Americans from their homelands, and so you think that would be clear cut.
Right.
But of course, Trump. Andrew Jackson is his favorite president. He doesn't want to see any of that happen, and it's just a terrible place that we're in right now.
Well, it is clear cut, which is that Trump loves the idea of keeping Andrew Jackson on the 20. It actually is extraordinarily clear cut, and I guess that he may at least get what he wants for a few years, and it will take 10 months for the investigation to even go on, at which point they will have to summarize its findings, and then maybe in 2022 we'll find out why they needed 8 extra years to make this happen.
I was looking at a brief brief history on women on U.S. currency, not so much coins, but just the bills. And it looks like, so you said Martha Washington, she was up on the $1 bill along with George in the 1880s and 1890s. Other than that, there was Pocahontas on the back of the $20 bill in the 1860s. There hasn't been a woman on U.S. paper currency since. So I think it's a long time coming. And as you said, also Harriet Tubman would be the first black person of any gender on U.S. currency. That also is a long time coming.
Big time stuff, no question about it. The Supreme Court has struck down a ban on trademarking words and symbols that are immoral or scandalous. This was a 6-3 decision. It was a victory for those seeking trademark protection for profane and even racist brand names. Now, we talked about this. I don't know how long this has been pending, Pat, but we've talked about this a couple of times before. This was a case brought by clothing designer Eric Brunetti, who wanted to trademark the phrase F-U-C-T. And this decision opens the door for him to get that brand trademarked. And the court was struggling with how to deal with the word, in particular, its pronunciation. And Justice Elena Kagan says that the clothing brand is pronounced as 4 letters, one after the other, F-U-C-T, but you could read it differently, and if so, you would hardly be alone. And she noted that it was described as the equivalent of the past participle form of a well-known form of profanity. I think we know exactly what we're talking about here. And this was the majority opinion, and most experts saw this as opening the door for a huge rush to trademark profane and racist stuff. First Amendment experts actually were divided about this. They were divided about whether Congress could enact a narrower law that might be upheld as constitutional. And Samuel Alito left no doubt at all about where he was. He says, quote, "Our decision does not prevent Congress from adopting a more carefully focused statute that precludes the registration of marks containing vulgar terms that play no real part in the expression of ideas." I guess that means if you wanted to just trademark the N-word in and of itself, presumably that's something that could be banned by Congress, but that this was too broad and therefore they have struck it down. Do you consider this a victory for free speech, Pat?
Yeah, I'm a fan of this. I think it's important, though, to separate profane language from racist and offensive language, though. Like, those are two different things entirely.
Yes.
The FUCT brand, other ones like it, I don't care. Like, if you want to use profanity, that's totally fine with me. I don't think that the FCC should be censoring our voices and making, a list of words that we can't say. I know you, with your background from South America, from Argentina, you don't care about this stuff either, right? But when it gets to more like offensive, racist language, I think maybe there you can have a conversation, because when government approves a trademark for something that is implicitly or explicitly racist, it's kind of like they're giving their backing to it.
They're
and I don't necessarily want to see
literally,
that.
It's
they're
called
protecting
trademark protection. And there are a lot of these, I don't know that I'd call them edge cases, but there are seemingly similar cases that often are adjudicated differently. So, for example, a clothing line called Jesus Died for You was approved, but one called Bong Hits for Jesus was denied. Like, I don't know. I mean, are these so different in a legal sense? Maybe the nuance escapes me.
And we've talked about this example before, too. There's an Asian American band called The Slants, and they apparently could not be denied trademark protection. But that was like a big story, whether or not they would be able to get their trademark approved as well. And I feel like it's a lot different when you have an Asian American band calling themselves this in sort of like a, endearing way, I guess. Like they're kind of making fun of themselves, or they're giving themselves this nickname.
You
versus
could say
if you
it's
had a group of
self-deprecating or satirical or tongue-in-cheek. I don't know.
Yeah, tongue-in-cheek. Versus if you had a band of white nationalists and they wanted to use a racist language. Let's say they wanted to call themselves the Slants. Like, those are two different things there, and I think that we should be able to adjudicate them separately, although I don't know necessarily if we can under the law.
Well, the other question is just what is the principle that should be at play? And I know we often talk about you've got to balance what is the principle and what is the application of that. And you want to establish principles, but really the difficult work is in the adjudication of individual cases. And here what the Supreme Court is saying is that the principle that would have been implicit in one decision here would be too broad and anti-constitutional, and they said 6-3. They're not having it. So we'll see what follow-up there is from Congress in terms of passing a narrower ban on these profane or otherwise controversial trademarks that some might want. Non-military households would pay a war tax to help cover the cost of health care for veterans of newly authorized wars under a plan that Democratic candidate Beto O'Rourke has unveiled earlier this week. His proposal is part of a bunch of different health and economic measures that are meant to improve care for veterans, which I think is a very worthy cause. He is calling also for an end to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is relatively uncontroversial at this point among the left. So the way that this would work is that money collected through the war tax, which he proposes for future wars, would go into a trust fund for veterans that's established at the start of each year. If you are a household that earns under $30,000 per year, you would pay $25. If you are a household that earns under $40,000, you would pay $57. It goes to $98 if you are under $50,000. And if you are under $75,000, you would pay $164. This scales all the way up to $1,000 for families or households earning more than $200,000. And the idea here is ideological and financial. Financial, it's we want to use this money to fund better health care for veterans, a very worthy cause. Secondly, the idea is it has become very easy for the average American to feel zero sacrifice when the United States gets involved in a military engagement. This was one of the big criticisms of the Iraq War, that it was just very easy because, unlike in prior wars in the United States, there were not product shortages, there were not fuel shortages, there were not significant price spikes in everyday goods. It's just very easy to go about your day, and whether the U.S. is or isn't at war in Iraq, whether thousands of people are dying or aren't dying, you don't really feel it in any way. So the idea here is there will be some kind of specific financial sacrifice attached to wars that the United States chooses to involve itself in. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, when we talk about scaling up tensions with Venezuela and Iran, potentially going to war with those countries, I think it's important that we as Americans think about what's going to be the result of that, and how many people are going to be killed, how many people are going to be injured, the health care that we're going to have to be paying out as a country because of those future conflicts, if they do indeed happen. And I think that's what puts this kind of bill puts us in that right mindset. Although at the same time, I don't know if having to pay, let's say, $98 if you make $50,000 a year as a household is going to make you feel as though you're also sacrificing for the country. Like, is that a substantial amount of money?
If the number is set too low, it's not really a sacrifice because you don't really feel it. And if it's set too high, it's also never going to have a chance at passing. And by the way, I think that this anyway isn't going to have a chance at passing. I think it's an interesting idea. I don't see this as very practically realistic in any way. But I do, I respect the underlying motivations that Beto O'Rourke is at least claiming to ascribe to this.
It's also an interesting way of means testing this, because not only is it dependent on how much money you make, how much the tax would be. Also, if you have a military household, you wouldn't have to pay the tax.
Right.
And I don't know if I've seen something similar to that. I don't know if I necessarily even agree with that. What do you think about that?
There are actually pretty significant legal issues with that as well. I mean, this is kind of like earlier in the week, there was a voicemail about reparations for Black Americans. And I said, I'm interested in the discussion. I think there's a case to be made. I think it's completely impractical in the sense that you're just not going to pass anything. It's just not going to pass. And there are very complicated logistics. And in a pragmatic sense, I think we should focus on other things. Much the same way, the idea here is interesting. It will never pass. There are not only political obstacles to it passing, there are even legal obstacles to it passing. And I think you're completely right to question whether this would be feasible as only what's the right word I'm looking for? Only applicable to non-military households.
Well, on the bright side, it looks like Beto O'Rourke is getting serious about policy.
Yes.
He has this war tax proposal. He had a climate change proposal. He dipped in the polls, I think, around the time Pete Buttigieg soared. And this is, I guess, the way to get back on track. Like, that's what Elizabeth Warren did. She just released policy paper after policy paper she's going up and up in the polls. I'm glad to see that. I'm glad to see that a policy-oriented campaign can do well, and maybe that's what Beto is trying to accomplish here.
It may be. I think it will be too little too late, although I respect it. And as I said a couple weeks ago, I think it's time for him to go back to Texas and challenge Republican Senator John Cornyn. But the idea that Elizabeth Warren's policy-based approach is doing so well that it might be encouraging Beto O'Rourke to take the same approach, that I like, although this particular proposal has no shot. But I'm interested to hear Beto O'Rourke continue to talk about it and defend it this week. That is it for today. Next week, the week will start as a normal week, and then we will head into the 4th of July holiday. I'll give you an update on the schedule at the beginning of next week.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.